Hello everyone. Today we will be reviewing the second part of Chapter 9. And so to begin with, the process of language acquisition has been subject of considerable controversy and contention among the different groups involving behaviorist, nativist, and interactional researchers. And so behaviorist explanations for language development include the viewpoints of Skinner. And so he theorized that we learn language like any other skill through reinforcement, shaping, and extinction, as well as any other operant principles. So as infants mature, they vocalize, and if these vocalizations are not reinforced, they gradually diminish. However, those that are reinforced remain in the child's repertoire or their vocabulary. So a second piece of evidence for his theory he believed to include children's imitation of speech patterns that they hear. And parents shape speech patterns by reinforcing grammatically correct forms or phrases. So, no milk for me, thank you. And also ignoring or punishing incorrect forms or phrases like, I know want milk. Problems with this theory include that parents don't spend much time teaching children to speak grammatically. Parents typically respond to truth content of statements rather than grammar. And so if a child says, nobody like me, the parents often respond with, why do you think that? Or I like you. Also, another problem with this theory is that children generate many more grammatical sentences than they ever hear in their lifetime. So suggesting children just don't imitate, but they actually learn these rules. So it's highly unlikely that each separate surface structure was heard, reinforced, and learned. So children's errors also tend to be overgeneralizations of grammatical rules that we talked about in the first section. And so behaviorist explanations would not predict these overgeneralizations if children were learning through trial and error. And then also continuing on with it, they wouldn't be making these overgeneralizations if they were just imitating their parents' behavior, or more so their language behavior. So next, the second perspective on language development includes nativist explanations, which have actually been found to be more empirically supported as opposed to behaviorist and interactionist explanations. And so Noam Chomsky viewed that language learning capabilities are built into the brain. And this is specialized to rapidly acquire language through some exposure to speech. So humans have a particular ability for language that is separate from general intelligence. And so this ability is facilitated by the language acquisition device. And this device, or this LAD, allows for the process of language information to be processed quicker and more efficiently. So support for nativist explanations include some individuals are geniuses for language acquisition despite low overall intelligence, indicating that language capacity may be distinct from other mental capacities and capabilities. So even people with the opposite problem, like individuals suffering from genetic dysphasia, which is characterized by an inability to learn the grammatical structure of language, despite having otherwise normal intelligence, can learn past tense forms one by one, although they cannot generalize the rule to another word. So one example of this is if a student writes on their paper, on Saturday I watch TV. The teacher corrects it, and the next week the child writes, on Saturday I took a bath and I watched TV and I went to bed. The student was able to take what he learned about the past tense and apply it to other verbs. So this suggests that typically developing children are hardwired to learn grammatical rules, while people with genetic dysphasia must learn it. And so there must be a biological predisposition which explains why newborn infants can make contrasts among phonemes that occur in all languages. So again, this provides another leg of support for this nativist explanation. The fourth reason or fourth piece of evidence that provides support for this explanation is that babies who are born deaf can actually, like we talked about in the first section, can babble speech sounds they've never heard before, and the pattern of language development is similar in children throughout the world. And so babies who are born deaf can babble speech they've never heard before, and babies' language development are similar across all cultures and across the world. So again, they believe that pointed to some biological predispositions, or just that this language acquisition ability is innate. And so lastly, the last piece of evidence supporting this nativist view is that language can only be acquired during a restricted period of development, as observed in songbirds. And so we will watch a video in class on Jeannie, but we've also mentioned her during the first chapter, talking about case study methods. But Jeannie was kept in virtual isolation until about the age of 13. And she only developed basic vocabulary after being taken out of that situation and put into some intensive academic remediation. She was only able to develop basic vocabulary but could not grasp grammatical rules in English. So once puberty is reached, acquiring language becomes difficult. And so again, that provides another leg up for the nativist theory. Problems with this theory. The nativist theory offers an explanation for why people acquire language, but not really how. So we know it's innate, but how is that innate? What does it actually look like? So it suggests that the brain can process language naturally, but no specifics of how this processing occurs. So it's only hypothetical at this point, and significantly, the theory does not consider environmental context. So this leaves a question about the influence of teachers on your own language acquisition throughout your childhood, your parents, and them teaching and shaping your language. And so finally, the interactionist explanation argues that yes, babies are born with this innate ability to learn, but what really helps them learn their language is social interactions. And so although infants are born with an innate ability to acquire language, social interactions play a crucial role in language acquisition. So this is why parents tailor verbal interactions to fit acquisition process. So examples of this is that parents talk or pronounce words slowly to children so that they can start to learn how to pronounce words correctly. They enunciate clearly. They use simpler sentences rather than when they speak to other adults. And problems with this theory often include similar arguments countering the nativist theory, including that they do not provide an explanation for how language develops. They merely explain why. And so from our standpoint, it actually does that. The name implies that it's innate. However, the ruling is still out on language development. So we have a clear picture of what's going on, yet we still don't know the process of why and how. There's still questions that are out there and that haven't really been addressed through this research yet. And so here we move on to examining the brain's influence on language development. And as the brain matures, the specialization of specific neurological structures take place. And this allows languages or our language acquisition to develop. So in early infancy, language processing in many areas of the brain becomes more concentrated or specialized in two areas, including Broca's and Wernicke's areas. So Broca's area is the left frontal cortex and is responsible for language production. So production of sequential patterns in vocal and sign languages, and this area was named after Paul Broca, who first reported on speech problems resulting from damage to the left frontal cortex. And Wernicke's area is located in the left temporal cortex and is responsible for language comprehension. So this area is highly active when we make judgments about a word meaning. And it was named after Carl Wernicke, who observed speech difficulty in patients with damage to the left cortex. Aphasia, on the other hand, is difficulty in producing or comprehending language, which results from damage to either Broca's or Wernicke's areas. And so Broca's aphasia is where individuals understand basic language relatively well, but struggle with speech production. So they may speak in short, staccato phrases of content morphemes. So like they can say cat or dog, but they have speech production without function morphemes such as and or but. And Wernicke's aphasia differs in two ways. Individuals can produce grammatically correct speech, but it tends to be meaningless, or they have considerable difficulty comprehending language. So, for example, individuals with damage to their Wernicke's area may say, I feel very well. In other words, I was used to be able to work cigarettes. I don't know how. Things I couldn't from are here. And so that is one example of damage to this Wernicke's area where you may experience this aphasia. So you are unable to comprehend any of the information that the individual is trying to convey to you. So these two areas are not the whole story. The right hemisphere also contributes to language and especially comprehension. So evidence for the involvement of the right lobe includes when words presented to healthy patients on their right hemisphere using divided visual fields, the right hemisphere shows some capacity for processing meaning of words. Patients with damage to the right hemisphere sometimes have subtle problems with language comprehension. A number of neuroimaging studies have revealed evidence of right hemisphere activation during language tasks. And then lastly, in support that's most directly related to language development is children who have their left hemisphere removed during adolescence, which is a typical treatment for severe cases of epilepsy, recover many of their language abilities. And so when considering how language and thought are related, there's evidence demonstrating that language does influence thoughts and perceptions. And so the linguistic relativity hypothesis is the proposal that language shapes the nature of thought. And this was originated by Benjamin Whorf, an engineer who studied language. And he cited evidence for this hypothesis by observing that Canadian Inuits to have many different terms for frozen white flakes of precipitation, which we call snow. And they perceive and think about snow differently than do English speakers. And so there's obviously criticisms to this theory or this hypothesis, and some of those include his anecdotal observations. And so his hypothesis on the linguistic relativity or how language shapes our thoughts. This was really just based on his observation, and it didn't include actually testing that out in the lab. And so his theory was based on anecdotal observations, and what we find is that newer studies actually cast doubt on his theory. But one important thing to remember about that is that although we do have newer studies that cast doubt on his theory, one thing to think about that is that his hypothesis was one of the first ones to actually ask or beg the question, how is language influencing or impacting thought and how we perceive things around us? And so that was really what spurred that type of research to happen. And so our thoughts and how we form concepts are often based on similarities. So for example, if we think of a dog, we automatically think of a four-footed animal with fur that wags its tail and barks. A bird is something that's small, winged thing that has a beak and flies. This is useful for us because it's our fundamental ability to think and make sense of our world. And so early theories describe concepts as rules that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for membership in a particular category. But what are the rules of dogship that include all dogs and excludes all non-dogs? And most people cannot come up with all of the necessary and sufficient conditions, but we can still recognize and classify an animal as a dog versus a non-dog. So our concept of what entails a type of animal and what does not entail that concept of an animal is similar to the family resemblance theory. And this states that members of a category have similar features that appear to be characteristic of the category members, but may not be possessed by all or every member. So one example of that could be if we think of dogs and we think of them wagging their tails, we may think of long tails, but not all dogs have long tails, or maybe they're not as furry as we think of dogs typically being. And so here we have an example of the family resemblance theory. So if your family is known for their high arched eyebrows, for example, your grandma Lucille has them, so does your mom, and so does your sister, but you don't have them. Just because you don't have them does not mean that you aren't a part of your family or that you are adopted. Even though your brother and sister may tease you that you are, that doesn't mean that you aren't a resemblance to your family as a whole. And so here we see that they all don't match all of these men within the picture, but they all share similar features within the family. So furthermore, the prototype theory explains that people make category judgments by comparing new instances to the category's prototype. So we're making simple comparisons between a new object and our prototype of what that object is. And so the prototype is the best or most typical member of a category. So a prototype of a bird may be like a wren. If we are in Antarctica, we may have a different prototype like a penguin. This type of cognitive process is located in the left hemisphere and visual cortex, suggesting that the prototype learning requires image processing. And so next, the exemplar theory is where people make category judgments by comparing a new instance with stored memories for other instances of the category. So if you're in the woods and you spot a four-legged animal, you might automatically think it might be a wolf or a coyote, but it reminds you of your neighbor's German Shepherd, so you don't freak out and take off running. This exemplar theory does a better job than prototype theory of accounting for categorization, because we can differentiate between prototypical and specific ways of processing. So this type of cognitive process is located in the right hemisphere, prefrontal cortex, and basal ganglia, which suggests that exemplar-based learning processes involve analysis and decision-making. So it's a higher order type of thinking rather than just thinking right back to a prototype that we have in our mind. So in this example, if the generic bird is your prototype, you will compare other animals to that prototype in order to determine if the animal is a bird. So if it's a wren, it's pretty close to the prototype, so you're more likely to categorize it as a bird. If it's a penguin, that's a bit different than the prototype that we have, so it'll be a little bit harder to classify it as a bird, but if it shares enough characteristics of the prototype, then you'll add it in to that category. So one thing to remember is that in prototype theory, we classify new objects as compared to a prototype. In exemplar, we classify new objects by comparing them to all the members of the category. And in this image, if you get the dog on the bottom and you have to categorize it, the prototype theory says that you will compare it to the photo on the right. Whereas the exemplar theory says that you will compare it to all of the examples that you know. So if you think about all of the dogs that your friends have, and you'll add that bottom dog into your collection of examples. And so really that wraps up the exemplar and prototype similarities and what distinctions between the two types of theories, and overall wraps up the second part of Chapter 9.